Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be diving into the emerging ecosystem of right-wing alternative online news media. These are media outlets that are typically natively online that present themselves as alternatives to the mainstream media and present narratives that are alternative to mainstream political discourse. So these are outlets like Breitbart in the US or Compact in Germany, and we typically associate them with the right, but technically there's nothing stopping a left-wing outlet from also being alternative. But in this episode, we're going to focus on right-wing alternative outlets, and in particular, how can members of Congress's engagement with these right-wing news sites be a signal of intra-party division? So intra-party division is a political science concept, and it's something that we're seeing both in the Republican and Democratic parties in the United States. So on the right, we have a division between the Trump wing of the Republican Party versus the never-Trumpers. And then on the left, we have the progressive Democrats versus the more moderate Democrats. And those divisions between a party is intra-party division. So what's cool about this episode, and you may have just picked up on it, is that we're going to be talking about political communication concepts dealing with alternative media online and also more traditional political science concepts around parties and party factions. So my guests today are Dr. Cord Knüpfer and Mike Coburn. Cord is an assistant professor and Mike is a PhD candidate at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin. And together they've been working on a paper that will soon go out for review entitled The Emerging Fault Line of Alternative News, Intra-Party Division in Republican Representatives' Media Engagement. So in that paper, they look at whether Republican members of Congress's engagement with right-wing news can be a predictor of their political position in this intra-party division, or we can basically say their political ideology. Is it extreme or is it not? And how does this political positioning relate to more traditional measures that political scientists use to measure where politicians are on the left-right spectrum? I'll wait till we get to the episode to talk more about it, but I thought it'd make the most logical sense to start by foregrounding some of Cord's recent research on these right-wing digital news infrastructures. So we're going to start out by talking about a paper published in Policy and Internet entitled Beyond Breitbart, Comparing Right-Wing Digital News Infrastructures in 6 Western Democracies. So here we'll be looking at United States online right-wing media sites, but also their influence in other democracies such as Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom. So we'll start out by talking about these alternative right-wing media sites. We'll talk about how they're transnationally linked. We'll talk about how politicians tweet about them may be a signal of their positions in these intra-party divisions. And then we go off on a tangent discussing these concepts before briefly discussing another one of Mike's studies about how Republican members of Congress adopt the fake news label and what that might signal about their political positions. So this interview was conducted on site at the JFK Institute. I'm very thankful for both Cord and Mike for hooking that up. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Cord Knüpfer and Mike Coburn. Again, they are at the JFK Institute at the Freie Universität in Berlin. Dr. Kurt Knüpfer and future Dr. Mike Coburn, thanks for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So before we dive into the specifics of your research, why don't we start out by introducing the listeners into your broader academic interest in studying these topics? I mean, when people hear fake news or alternative right-wing media, they probably load all sorts of preconceived ideas about whether challenges to the mainstream media are good or bad for democracy. So stepping outside of normative judgment for a moment, I'd like to ask each of you, why are you interested in studying these topics in terms of how they relate to your research interests?
Sure. So if I can go first. I started out by studying basically right-wing media in the United States, and I'm still interested in the intersection of politics generally and media and how they intersect. And I studied framing for a while, and really here the idea is that media present a discursive environment where politicians can basically legitimize what they do, right? So in a way, what we see in the media, what the media allow politicians to say, also is going to reflect what politics does.
So my interest really comes from looking at how these things intersect with institutions, and particularly looking at how information and political parties interact with each other. So particularly looking at US political parties, because I think there's some specific dynamics going on there, particularly on the Republican side, which I think has basically become unable to contain its rightward flank, both at an elite level and at an activist level. And we see that things like social media and media more generally get blamed for that pretty often. And I actually think, coming from a position as a scholar of parties, that some of the more traditional explanations, so things like electoral incentives, can also be a powerful explainer of why that is. And I think it's a much more kind of nuanced and complicated relationship with these communication platforms that is pretty commonly portrayed.
Definitely. And I'm looking forward to dive into some of these studies that you've done both independently and together. But I think it makes sense to start with Kurt's research on right-wing online news sites. And before getting specifically into the right-wing part, though, I think it's important to outline a conceptual point that you emphasize in the paper, which is that alternative media are defined by their anti-establishment position in contrast to legacy media, not their attachment to a particular ideology. So could you recap that argument for us and tell us a bit about your motivations for focusing on right-wing sites specifically?
Sure. This was research that we started out doing at the Weizenbaum Institute here in Berlin. And Annette Heft, who works there, took the lead on this. And we worked on this with Susanne Reinhardt and also a colleague from Roskilde in Denmark, Eva Meyerhofer. And basically, we started out by mapping kind of the public sphere. So we were generally interested in what's changing in publics. And one thing that really stood out was the rise of alternative media generally. And there's a burgeoning literature on this, people pointing out that the digital space provides new opportunities for newsmakers, basically to challenge the mainstream. And we started out with that, but then we looked specifically at where is this interesting currently? And I think we'll get to this later on as well when we talk about Republicans in the US specifically. But to us, it made sense to look at those challengers of mainstream news that are currently, that we perceive to be the loudest and most important at the time that we started this research as well. And that's what's going on the right.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've all heard of prominent US examples like Breitbart. But what I think is really interesting about this study is you took a broader focus on 6 countries, the US, the UK, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and Austria. And so you and your colleagues developed a classification scheme to set out identifying right-wing online news sites in each of these countries. So what were the key criteria used to classify these sites, and how did you go about actually finding them?
So yeah, that's an excellent question. So we had 4 criteria basically to use as classifiers for websites. The first was that they're newsy, right? So they have to kind of fulfill this function of journalism to some degree. So we didn't want kind of the fake news or just blogs or somebody, and they were supposed to be alternative in their outlook. So self-classifying as being outside of the mainstream. The third classifier was that they were supposed to be right-wing. So they openly embraced criteria that we defined as right-wing, xenophobic, etc. And the last thing was that they were supposed to be nationally located. So we didn't want to look specifically at things like Russia Today or the Epoch Times, which are kind of these transnational sites, but we wanted things that spoke to a nationalized audience. When we went about looking for these, so we're not saying this is an extensive list that we came up with, but what stood out to us was that the 6 different countries in our sample were very different in terms of locating sites like this. For the US, it's really easy. And you can snowball, basically. And you have a lot of also watchdog organizations that compile these lists. But for places like the UK or Denmark, it turns out to be a lot more difficult to even find sites that fulfill these criteria.
Yeah, and I want to dig into some of these findings, and there's tons in the paper. Of course, listeners can go to the episode description and get the link and read more. But I thought the most interesting was the uneven number of alternative sites across the countries, which you argue relates to transnational audiences and shared language areas. So could you unpack those country-level findings for us and explain how that transnational component might explain such uneven levels in these alternative right-wing media outlets?
Yeah, so we actually conducted a follow-up study. So the first one was basically locating these sites and comparing the countries. And we had, indicators for kind of how we chose the countries that we looked at. So classic, media studies, different media systems. So we defined, for example, Sweden and Germany as two countries that tend to ostracize the right wing a little bit. So that shun right-wing politicians from the mainstream, for example. And these were things that aren't necessarily given in Denmark or the UK, for example. So we had differences on the contextual level, but our follow-up study really looked at how these sites interact and what the shared audience for these sites might be, and also how they link to one another. And here's really where we saw some of these dynamics in how these sites interact and also how they draw audiences transnationally.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because let's say you take the example of Germany and Austria. I mean, they speak the same language, German. So in a sense, there's not so much of a demand side need for Austrian outlets because they can pick it up from Germany, or in the case of the UK, they can pick it up from the US.
Yeah, so for Austria, we actually found a higher number relative to Germany. So Germany had a higher number, but Austria's number was higher relative to, if you compare the UK to the US, if that makes sense. So we're also seeing that for the Austrian sites, they get traffic from Germany as well. And that kind of makes sense, if you think about the context of kind of the so-called migration crisis, etc. You see a lot of overlap in the discourses. If you think of transnational right-wing movements like the identitarian movement, etc., right, where, outspoken leaders of that sit in Austria. But for the US, which is kind of an interesting outlier case, where you have this huge number comparatively of these sites. And most of these countries that we looked at, people speak English there. So the US really doesn't only draw attention from the UK, which it does, but also from Sweden, for example, and also from Germany. So people in Sweden, I think, are very cognizant of what's going on the kind of alt-right, etc. scene in the US, and they have a shared discourse.
Yeah, I was shocked to see how many. I mean, Sweden, where I come from, has such a huge number relative to the size of the country, whereas the UK didn't. And Mike, I know you're not a media scholar, so we'll get into your political science chops in just a second. But you're from the UK, and I was wondering, do you think maybe there's some aspect where, because there's such a rich tabloid press there, that perhaps that's something that might explain, like, in a sense, The Sun, The Express. I mean, these are kind of somewhat alternative news.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And if you think about the amount of traffic going through sites like the Daily Mail or whatever, they're obviously not constructing alternative news in this sense, but they're a lot ideologically closer to the right than certainly if we compare it to what the mainstream media landscape looks like in the United States. Commonly positioned as being left of center, or certainly left of what a lot of the people in the United States think. That's just not the case in the United Kingdom. And the retaining of power or the retaining of communicative power by these newspaper organizations, I think really does stand out, certainly when you're comparing the UK to the US at least.
Mm. Now, we could keep going down the alternative news rabbit hole, as they say, but I'd like to switch over to discussing your joint research on how U.S. legislators are engaging with these sites. And that's important, obviously, because members of Congress can be key amplifiers and legitimators of news sources. But I think the core argument you're making in that project is slightly different, but much more interesting. So, Mike, can you introduce us to that research? What might hyperlinking to specific news sources reveal about American politics more broadly?
Absolutely. So this is the paper that we're currently working on that looks at the alignment between what we term as political positionality of Republican members of the House of Representatives and their engagement with these alternative far-right news sources via hyperlinks in their tweets. So amongst elites, news media have been positioned as fulfilling what's termed as a dual function. So elites, like the rest of us, have to get their news information from somewhere. So that's kind of the first side of the dual function. But also it's positioned that elites are competing for, in this case, voters' attention. And so what we do in this paper is we apply a slightly different dual function that we think hyperlinks fulfill. So again, we've got this informational source where the hyperlinks really are aiming to raise awareness of agenda or of policy items. And then this second signaling function, which is used to indicate a representative's awareness of specific informational contexts, with the goal of establishing a kind of in-group dynamic within this fragmented media ecosystem. And we think this is particularly important on the right, given the proliferation of alternative news sources such as Newsmax and OAN. At the same time, we've also seen this rightward turn in the Republican Party at an elite level. And this, this has brought with it this kind of hostility to norms and practices that we expect from a party in a democratic country.
And before we get into the specifics of how you tested some of these assumptions, it's important to understand how members of Congress's political ideology, or more accurately, as you put it, their political positionality, can be measured. So just as a bit of a crash course for the listeners tuning in who are not classically trained political scientists, can you explain the general idea behind scaling legislators' political positions?
Absolutely. And your phrasing is important and quite correct here. So what our metrics of positionality are capturing are probably best thought of as being proxies for ideology. So our measures for positionality essentially consider the US elite political conflict, that is political conflict among elites like members of the House of Representatives, along a single dimension of left to right. So we see a lot of research from the US that show that elite competition is now structured along this singular dimension. And indeed, that's actually how many polarization scholars conceive of polarization in the modern era, the absence of cross-cutting cleavages, so things that might make people otherwise agree. And instead, we see this alignment along a single continuum. And so basically, we use these different measures to position elites along that continuum and to estimate their position in Congress.
Yeah, and we've talked about these DW nominate scores in a previous podcast, but you include 3 measures of political positionality. So could you explain each of these measures and why you decided to include all 3 in the study rather than just one?
Absolutely, and as you say, we're kind of fortunate in this area that there's been a lot of work done already. One of the measures we use are these nominate scores. So just as a recap, maybe for your listeners who didn't hear it last time, but this is a scaling measure based on members' voting records in Congress, developed by Paul and Rosenthal way back in the 1980s. And without getting too far into the weeds, the scale essentially produces a score based on patterns of roll call voting, and specifically how often they vote with other members. And so that ends up with members of Congress having a score between -1 at the very liberal end of the spectrum and +1 at the most conservative end of the spectrum. So that's the first of the 3 measures of positionality that we use. But we also think that there might be some other indicators as well. And so the second measure we use is membership of an ideological caucus. So these caucuses are sub-party groups that meet in Congress and are broadly considered as having some kind of alignment in terms of ideology or positionality. And this measure has actually been used in a lot of the recent work in the last few years on intra-party factions. And so we consider membership of either the House Freedom Caucus or the Liberty Caucus as basically being another measure of far-right positionality or further right positionality among Republicans in Congress. And then the final thing that we use, because we think that Trump has meaningfully impacted intra-party divisions in Congress in terms of political rhetoric. So Trump has fundamentally changed some Republicans' approach to political communication. And so to measure that, we actually use a measure of lexical similarity with Trump on Twitter. And this was developed by a PhD student, Joseph Cerrone, who's at George Washington University. And we use that as our third measure. And we think that these measures are actually capturing slightly different aspects of positionality. So in the first case, they're including position taking that representatives might think is good for other reasons, like their constituency wants it. And then the second measure we think is also a signal to other elites. So is measuring a slightly different thing there. And then the third case, really we're trying to measure degree of adoption of, for want of a better word, Trumpiness. And that might run along a slightly different dimension than the other measures. And so we think that all 3 of those measures are important.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of this Cerrone score. It's kind of, this is like some kind of classifier, I guess, that's been trained on Trump tweets. And then they try to see how likely other tweets are related to Trump.
That's exactly what it's not published yet, but we were on the same panel at APSA, and he's doing fantastic work. So this is basically what that score gives you. Yeah,
I want to run my tweets through the Trump score.
Yeah.
And see. we could have a bet, and whoever has the highest has to buy beer. So the overarching hypothesis in the study is that the further right the politicians were on these scales, the more likely they were to engage with alternative right-wing media sites on Twitter. So can you describe how you measured right-wing media engagement, as well as what controls you added to the models?
Sure. So kind of on the Ivy side, right? So we have these measurements for how ideological are members of Congress, but then on our dependent variable side, we have these metrics for engagement with right-wing alternative media. And so, spoiler, we use our classification system that we were just talking about. So we use these sites that we've collected for the US, which is a smallish sample of, I want to say about 35 sites that we've handpicked and classified. So we're pretty sure that we know what we're dealing with there. But then we use additional indicators for this metric as well. So we also went with the Media Cloud collections. So Media Cloud, if people aren't familiar with it, is a fantastic resource online where you can do research. And it's basically an archive of all of these online sources of news. And they classify websites basically by looking at partisanship on Twitter and which links are exclusively shared by people who, for example, only follow Donald Trump versus people who only follow Hillary Clinton, etc. And this gives us a score, again, ranging from -1 to +1, where we can say that -1 would be links that are proportionally only shared by liberals, probably, and a +1 would be kind of far-right media. And then we did the same for a site called All Sides Media, which it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, but they make this chart. I don't know if you're familiar with it, with all of the logos of the media organizations.
Yes, and they did not put the podcast on there. I added it myself.
Where is that? Where does that rank? But people take issue with this often, right? When you classify media along a left-right continuum, and then you find the New York Times to the left of something, and then Breitbart on the same slot on the right. So we're very cognizant of this. We didn't just want to include like one measurement for this, but they also classify media along an ideological dimension, and we think that plotting it out this way gives us an additional indicator. So we have 3 different indicators, really a quantitative large one, a really hand-picked qualitative sample, and then the third one kind of in between that draws on expert advice and also crowdsourcing kind of how media are classified. And we think this is it's a pretty robust measurement overall to get kind of alternativeness and right-winginess, if you will, of specific hyperlinks.
We also try and control out the noise. So we think that essentially the district that the representatives come from might matter. And so we control things like district partisanship, the racial demographics of the district, and also district incomes. So we think that all of those things might matter in some different way. We also then introduce a control based on individuals or representatives' use of Twitter. So we control for the total number of tweets sent in the period that we're interested in. Really, we do that because we think that high users might be using the platform of Twitter in some kind of meaningfully different way to other representatives in Congress. And we want to kind of control for that noise and to better focus on these dimensions that Cord is talking about.
Yeah, I think it's cool because you have 3 measures of positionality of the members of Congress, and then you have 3 measures of media engagement. And so ultimately, for the big reveal, what did the findings show?
I'll let Mike take this one. Mike.
You'll be surprised to hear that essentially we're finding that all of these measures of political positionality are aligned with whatever measure of media engagement we choose to use. So we also show that Republican representatives are engaging with this far-right news media, and we really want to kind of flag that we think that's a problem. We think this is a concern on its own. But that also we can start to make some predictions around what type of Republicans, based on their other behaviors, are likely to engage with this kind of news media engagement. In other words, Republicans with farther right voting records who were members of these ideological caucuses or who were kind of like Trump in their political rhetoric were much further to the right on these in terms of their engagement with news media sources.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I think you're getting at in the paper is that, and I'll just ask y'all directly, can engagement with these sites be a good predictor of one's political positionality?
So I think we want to shy away from kind of unidirectional kind of causal argumentation, etc. But yes, I think that's what we're getting at, right? So we want to say that if you think about like what do hyperlinks really represent, and we talk about this dual function that Mike mentioned, and we say information goes in, right, but also the signaling function to signal to your followers, etc. Then of course, when we look at what these legislators are consuming and what media they choose to engage with publicly, then obviously this is their public, right? These are the agenda items that they're going to be focused on. This is, their legislative legacy that they're kind of solidifying. This is their rhetoric, etc. So if there's a link to all of these independent metrics for, ideology on the side of the legislators, and we see that that correlates with news media engagement, then yes, I think we found a new predictor, or a predictor that we should place alongside these other metrics for political positionality.
Definitely. I think it's super interesting. And the findings, they point to this potentially problematic dynamic, I think, which we might call some type of confirmation bias for right-wing members of Congress. I mean, traditionally, legislators were constrained to sharing news produced by reputable news outlets. And of course, in the American context, news has become so partisan over time, maybe it's not so reputable compared to public broadcasters in Europe. But if it's the case that right-wing politicians can draw from any number of dubious online sources to fit their narrative, wouldn't that seem to give them an advantage over politicians constrained to what established media report?
Well, again, yes. I think, we don't want to stretch kind of the implications of our very specific findings here too far. But of course, this is the larger picture, right? This is the concern in the back of our, at least my mind. And we can maybe also talk about asymmetry a little bit, that we don't probably, if people want to pick up this type of research and do this for Democrats and on the left side of the spectrum, I don't personally expect them to find necessarily the same findings just located on the left, specifically because this news media environment doesn't really exist to the same degree. So when people talk about left-wing media, what they oftentimes are still referring to are legacy media, journalistic outlets that tend to police each other for veracity and factuality, etc. Whereas on the right, and this kind of alternative news ecosystem that we're seeing, we don't have the same mechanisms, right? So here, oftentimes, they're not constrained by factuality, but they, as Benkler out of Harvard puts it, they police each other for partisanship, right? So if somebody deviates from the partisan line, they get flack from these other news sites, alternative news sites.
And we can talk about the electoral incentives and the institutions that make that possible. So we know that the Republican Party, or the current manifestation of the Republican Party, is likely to win the Senate and the Electoral College with around 47% of the vote. That doesn't give them a very big incentive to keep everyone in the ship and keep everyone on board. And even in the House of Representatives, with the combination of gerrymandering and the kind of clustering of Democratic voters in these urban areas, the Republican Party kind of know that they have ways of winning elections without even winning the majority of the votes. And so when media or members of their party kind of go off into a certain direction, quite often there's not any electoral penalties for doing that. And that then obviously perpetuates. Conversely, of course, the Democrats have exactly those incentives because they know that in order to win an election, they actually need to win kind of 51, 52% of the vote. And so that really just is giving very, very different incentives to the two parties in terms of engaging with this stuff.
Definitely. I wanted to ask you about why don't we see this left-wing alternative ecosystem? And I think what people who actively read and seek out these alternative right-wing sites would say is that the entire mainstream media is left. But that still doesn't necessarily explain, I think what your research is getting at is there's this fracturing within the Republican Party between the kind of far right wing and the more moderate wing. We see the same thing on the left as well in terms of the progressive versus the moderate. So you would think that there would be some type of radical progressive media sites that are coming out. And as far as I know, those don't quite exist.
So I think that I've kind of got three answers to this. And I've kind of would say that there's this practical answer that you're getting at here, that the Democratic voters are not as far from institutions like the New York Times or whatever. And while there is certainly a cohort of Democratic voters that are critical of these institutions, they're not actively hostile to their existence. And they don't think it's engaged in some kind of operation against their political goals. It's also worth noting on that front that the Democratic Party coalition is just much more diverse than the Republican Party coalition. So that means that constructing any alternative media is much more complex. The second point I would make is a point of ideological commitment. So I think that at this point in time, it's not unfair to say that there is a partisan difference in commitment to truth and willingness to abandon that commitment to truth for partisan gain. And then finally, I think the kind of deeper and longer standing cultural aspect is also important here. So we might want to think of this classic split of Americans being operationally liberal but symbolically conservative. So that means that often these differences that you talk about, such as like the differences between progressives and moderates on the left, these tend to be differences in policy preferences. And differences in policy preferences can be negotiated over and can be compromised on, whereas these differences on the right tend to be activated by kind of both personal and national identity. And these are particularly around questions of race and the maintenance of white control of power in the US. And these have been shown to just be much more powerful forces and much more difficult to kind of find compromise on and to make agreement on.
Also, I mean, adding to that, the media sphere. Sure, there are progressive websites, right? There are specific niche sources that you might consider to be, extreme left or radically left, etc. in the US. But it's nowhere near the scale of what we're seeing on the right. And I think here we can also kind of, we can have like a supply and demand narrative. And oftentimes kind of we stick to the demand side, that we say, well, there's this demand, Fox viewership, etc., right, is high. They're making money with all of this. Breitbart gets a lot of clicks, etc. And I think that's true. But to some degree, there's also the supply side to consider here. To manufacture right-wing news, and I'm going to get, your listeners can call in and complain about me for this one, but manufacturing kind of far-right news, I would venture, is financially easier to do in this right-wing ecosystem. If we look at kind of content analyses, one study that I conducted over the course of the last summer was on things like Antifa, right? Where we see these agenda items pop up, and then an entire ecosystem kind of talking about a topic or theme, similar things with critical race theory going on right now, where they're all taking cues and they're all talking about the same agenda. But if you really dig down into what they're talking about, nobody's actually going out reporting things. Nobody's actually coming up with news stories or talking about policy. They're manufacturing kind of these threats to a particular way of living from a partisan perspective. And that's fairly easy to do. And I would say that Democracy Now!, for example, et cetera, on the left, they're not alike in terms of what they're doing in their news output.
Because it's expensive to fund journalists. And I guess Democracy Now! And maybe the Young Turks would be, who've been quite successful, at least, using digital media.
What oftentimes we also lack on the left, though, is funding, right? So oftentimes these are funded organizations, also in public radio, et cetera, that get funded by their listeners, by their viewers, et cetera. Whereas on the right, we oftentimes see the influence of very rich individuals or families. If you think about the Mercers, if you think about the Coke Industries kind of, funding foundations that then feed this entire ecosystem, et cetera. And we don't see the same structures on the American left, arguably.
Yeah. I was hoping to save this discussion towards the end, but I do want to get to Mike's study on using the fake news label, because I think what this discussion highlights is that Republican legislators particularly have a kind of source advantage in drawing from, as you were saying, Kurt, these kind of fabricated stories that are not well reported. And so there's this advantage that these legislators have to source kind of any narrative that agrees with their opinion, but then they also have the ability to deploy the fake news label. So they both have like a sourcing and an attack advantage. And Mike, you've done some research on this. How is legislators' political position related to how likely they are to attack the media through the fake news label?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a paper I published last year called Legislator Adoption of the Fake News Label. And very similar to the findings we could, we find in that paper, first of all, that Republican members of Congress are using this label as an attack on recognized institutions of media. So importantly, what they're not doing is using that to correct false information. What they are using that term and that label to do is to galvanize support against these media institutions. And so, a sizable minority of Republican representatives are now using that term. on Twitter. And as with this study, we can predict which ones are more likely to use that term based on these kind of in-person indicators of positionality. And in that study, particularly the DW Nominate scores, so basically those representatives who are voting in a more conservative way are also the ones who are more likely to engage with this kind of rhetoric.
And it's important because I thought it was interesting that it's not exactly a clear line, right? There's also some very conservative members who don't necessarily adopt the fake news label.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're sort of seeing that in the Liz Cheney debate that's going on at the moment. So Liz Cheney was one of those highly conservative members who doesn't engage with this kind of practice. And I mean, since that paper has been published, she's been kind of ostracized within the Republican Party. I think I saw this week Ted Cruz suggesting she run in the Democratic primary in Wyoming next year. I mean, the idea here is that perhaps what we might historically have thought of as being a traditional dimension of conservatism is now kind of being somewhat changed by these other dimensions that we can pick up with this kind of engagement.
Yeah, it's very cool. And I hope at least what the listeners picked up from this podcast is kind of, I think the work you're doing is super interesting because it's this blend of the kind of media, political communication side, and then also the political science side. So Kurt, Mike, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Michael.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Kurt Knüpfer and Mike Coburn, who are respectively assistant professor and PhD candidate at the Freie Universität Berlin. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Let's see. I might be able to get one more episode in before the 6th annual, I think, year in review. But if not, sit tight, no worries. I've got plenty of interviews lined up for January and some interesting topics coming your way. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Berlin. See you next time.